You're listening to Market Champions, a podcast on navigating the financial markets. Here's your host, Srivatsan Prakash.
This episode of Market Champions is brought to you by Simplify ETFs. For more information, visit simplify.us. No simplified funds will be discussed during this podcast. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Market Champions. I just wanted to remind you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Really helps the page grow, really helps the podcast grow. Thank you so much for your support. And now on to the interview. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Market Champions. Today, I've got a really special guest. I've got Mr. Bill Sheriff. Bill Sheriff is the executive chairman and on the board of directors of enCore Energy Corp. And he is one of the most experienced people and one of the smartest people when it comes to uranium and metals and minerals in general. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, Bill. It is awesome to have you.
Well, thanks, Sri. That's a hard intro to live up to, but I'll give it a try.
Thank you. Bill, so for the people in the audience who might not know you, could you sort of give a bit of your background, and your work in the metals and mining business?
Sure. I'm a geology graduate. I've been working in the industry since the early 80s. Mm-hmm. A lot of time in gold, but probably almost as much time in uranium. And also have a bit of background in the brokerage business. Had my own brokerage company for a number of years and market maker. And it served me well moving into the public company sector back around 2000. And I've been involved with a number of public companies on boards. Probably the best known and most successful was Energy Metals that co-founded with Paul Matisik back in 2004. Mm-hmm. Started it with $1.7 million market cap, and 30 months later sold out for 1.8 billion. Yep. But proving timing is everything. I mean, we were pretty adept at putting together a large uranium resource, but timing it was perfect storm, perfect timing on everything from raising money to selling out. So it was a good thing, and during that time we assembled an awfully good team. Real impressive folks. Uranium's it wasn't then in short supply. It's not now. It's the 8th most abundant element on the planet. The problem is not so much in finding deposits. The biggest scarcity, in my opinion, is finding the technical experts to both permit it, remove it, process it, understand the fuel cycle, and then ultimately reclaim it. And so we were very fortunate to, even after Energy Metals and Uranium One involvement with Uranium One, to keep a good core staff together and build on that at enCore. And that's the current endeavor is enCore Energy.
Got it. And so, moving on to talking about, the uranium market in general. So the core thesis of a lot of uranium investors is primarily that some part of, the shift towards ESG will have to come from uranium. And so, to that end, are winners and losers being increasingly determined, by political factors over economic ones? And if so, do you see sort of nuclear winning out over, say, the next few years and the next few decades?
Well, I think it's both, from a political standpoint, but equal that by itself won't do it. And we aren't going to get there through subsidies. So even though the Western world seems to be enamored with giving away vast sums of cash for doing very little these days, I think it's got to be an economically promising and viable proposition, or it's not going to succeed. Mm-hmm. And dependability is another big factor. So you've kind of got the three things there. And if you're going to eliminate fossil fuels or greatly reduce them, don't know that you're going to eliminate them, but certainly greatly reduce them, you really have no other choice other than nuclear. Certainly wind and solar are not going to be there to provide the base load and the dependability. So, and economically in the long run, especially when you're seeing the many of the nuclear power plants in the U.S. having the license extended for additional decades due to their very safe record and maintenance, such that the infrastructure can withstand, basically a doubling of their life in some instances. The economic aspect becomes quite attractive.
Got it, got it. And overall public sentiment in a way is sort of opposed to it. It's sort of driven by the scare factor from crises like 3 Mile, Fukushima, etc. So, what is going to cause public sentiment overall to change? And will nuclear eventually become good politics?
Well, I think time is the biggest factor on healing those, and of course, the media has probably forever been prone to sensationalization, and nothing lends itself quite to as much sensationalization as radiation, because you can't see it.
Mm-hmm.
And they drum up a lot of fear factors over it. But it typically takes about a decade in the market before the investors and the public memory fades, the immediate memory of the crisis fades. But more importantly, I think with each innovation in safety, regardless of whether we're talking about electric toaster, the automobile, jet airplanes, or nuclear power plants, almost every improvement in safety comes as a result of a failure. Mm-hmm. And without those failures, you don't know what to plan for. And I'm not going to say there'll never be another incident in the nuclear business, but I'm reasonably certain there'll never be another Chernobyl because of what we learned there. Mm-hmm. There'll never be another Fukushima because of what we learned and possibly should have known before that happened. Don't put your fuel rod storage on the 3rd floor, and don't bury your backup generator stations where it could be flooded. But some things are more obvious after the fact. So, but each time we get these improvements, and one of the big improvements that's come along is there are many of them, but one of my favorite ones is the encapsulation of the fuel rod, such that it's in segments instead of continuous long rods. And of course, that it's not meltdown proof, but it's highly meltdown resistant. Under any conceivable circumstances, it could not melt down. And of course, that's the big fear. So, the track record of operational safety is phenomenal when compared to the other industry. And, I suspect that will be improved as we go forward. As I say, all these other industrial situations have been. So, we'll always be subject to the sensationalism of the press, but, the realization that it does provide a very safe baseload, and that we aren't in the 1940s or 50s in terms of our understanding and knowledge of use of nuclear power. So I think you'll see a growing acceptance, and there's going to have to be a rationalization. Like I say, if you're going to not rely on fossil fuels, mm-hmm. your choices are limited until fusion, if it ever becomes practical. It's certainly not going to be a factor in the next couple of decades commercially. So, and potentially ever, who knows? But I think, given that choice, we're going to have greater acceptance. And, I think, most of that is signified by most of the people that worked in the utility business or nuclear business have no qualms about having one in their backyard, so to speak, in the neighborhood. Yep. So, if you look at statistics, it's one of the safest industries on earth.
Yep.
At least the crow will be muted.
Yep. So, another thing that, a lot of people who are sort of skeptical about uranium sort of view it as nuclear power as, a slow dying industry in the Western world. So what, number one, needs to happen in a practical sense, for a revival overall?
Well, I think this is where your perception discussion really comes in. And, it's the nuclear renaissance that we're seeing now is not being driven by the Western world. There's certainly an increase in activity in general with the extended licensing of plants, new plants coming on in the UK and the US. But really the big build outs in China, Russia, and the Middle East. And so these are the places that are driving it. The rest of the world, I think, will come around to seeing it that way. But the perception is far more important in the Western world than it is in the other places I've mentioned.
Got it. And recently there's been quite a few announcements, say over the last, 12 to 24 months of nuclear plant closures in places like the U.S. and South Korea and a couple of other places. So what are your take? What is your take on that?
Well, I think that's almost the runoff, if you will, or the trailing tail of sentiment over the last decade. And what you're seeing now is while that fear aspect that you'd mentioned and concern over what you do with the waste and that sort of thing, has been the typical media story for the past couple of decades, certainly ever since Fukushima. And I think you're seeing the tail end of that. Most of these closures were actions that were initiated years ago. Mm-hmm. And now you're seeing the uptick coming from the realization that, if you're going to be fossil fuel conscious, you can't rely simply on solar and wind. So, we're starting to see, more and more of these extended power operations, also an increase in the power rating on a number of these plants.
Yep.
And what I think a lot of people don't realize is if you've got a half a dozen or so plants that are authorized to increase their power level, mm-hmm. That consumes enough uranium to make up for an additional power plant. So, and that's why you're not seeing the demand in uranium really fall off with these closures. And certainly, the new plants, as I mentioned, big ones in the UK. There's still some coming on here in the next year or two with Southern Company in the US. And but you're seeing a lot of them in the Middle East and as I mentioned before, obviously China.
Got it. And now something you mentioned earlier in this interview is this nuclear fuel cycle that's sort of, in a way, opaque and not very well known. So could you sort of describe how the nuclear fuel cycle actually works? Sure.
I mean, a lot of investors especially concentrate on the yellow cake price or the spot price for uranium. Mm-hmm. It's certainly a viable thing to watch, but it's not the only thing to watch because it takes about 2 years from the time you produce yellow cake from the mine site, be it conventional or in situ, until it's fabricated and put into a nuclear reactor. It's at least 2-year process. And during that time, you take the yellow cake and then you convert it into gas, UF6, uranium hexafluoride, which is also a quoted commodity. Therefore, it's a replaceable commodity. If one price is lagging, the other one may be more economical for an ultimate consumer, being the nuclear utility. Once it's into the gas form, then it goes through enrichment. And this is where you have separative work units, SWUs or SWU, that you commonly hear. And here again, that's another price, and it's a little bit of a difficult concept to get around, but I like to think of it as the cost of enrichment, the amount of energy that goes into separating the fissionable material from the non-fissionable, and enriching that to the 3 to 5% that you need for a power plant, or in the event of some of these new smaller reactors, we're talking about going up into the 20% range. Just by context, to become weapons grade, you need about 95%. So we're very far away from that, and don't want the two to be confused.
Got it.
But those are the aspects. And then once, of course, you get it enriched, then you go through the fabrication process. And that's where you fabricate it into the fuel rods or potentially the fuel pellets, as I mentioned before.
Got it. And could existing inventories actually be deeper than people think, especially when you look at places like China and Russia? Well, what are your thoughts on global uranium inventory overall?
Well, there have been people saying that the above ground stockpile is about to run out for the better part of 20 years now. And clearly there have been some underestimations or over optimism on the depletion of that. Mm-hmm. Of course, the START program and various other things, megatons to megawatts, or these sort of programs have obviously had an impact. But I think the reality is, if you look at the utilities, especially in the U.S. where we concentrate, is still the biggest consumer base in the world. Mm-hmm. So they'll be replaced by China in the next decade or two, but certainly now the U.S. is the biggest consumer. These utilities are not supplied much beyond the end of this year or the next year. And, they obviously, when I say not supplied, doesn't mean they're going to run out January 1st, but they're running low, and they like to keep a year or two's inventory in front of them. So based on the tone we get from the uranium buyers, assessment of above ground inventories at this point, I think we finally have reached that point. Back during the last uranium boom 04 to 07, there was a lot of discussion about that as well. And, yes, that is always a concern, but really that whole boom was a supply side problem. It was a perfect storm of supply interruption. With MacArthur River being flooded, Ranger in Australia, which was up and running strong, was flooded with monsoons, and
Right.
then Russing in Namibia was cut back so far because of the health of their workforce. So you take several of those events, and you've suddenly got a supply constraint. Then you've got the worries. It's obviously a very emotional commodity, so it got kind of carried away. There wasn't a lot of new supply coming in. Cigar Lake wasn't on yet. A number of things like that. So I think that may be one of the key differences between then and now as well. It's kind of, you didn't really ask, but kind of a good segue into what's different this time. And I think this is a demand driven, and it goes to reflect a true product into the market, product consumed in the market. So if you can take away the stockpile discussion, which I think is getting very close to depleted, or down to an ordinary maintenance level, put it that way, certainly not in an oversupply position that it's been for most of the last 2 decades or more, going back to 3 Mile Island. You can see that several of the top 10 mines have restricted or closed down. So you're getting a slight constraint on the supply side, but really it's more and more demand. There have been a few closures, as you mentioned, but I think the increased power levels and the increased reactors around the world are certainly more than enough to make up for that going forward. And so I think we're going to be in a pretty healthy, I hate to say normal, because I'm not sure what normal is in the nuclear industry, but more of a normal supply demand picture going forward for them, certainly a constructive one going forward.
Got it. And now, I wanted to segue into some questions specifically to, enCore Energy and discuss some of that. So, one thing that, a lot of people are curious about is somehow your style of, acquiring resources is sort of, MDay and so on. So what is the MDay pipeline looking at right now? And, how confident are you about, enCore's, ability to take bigger bites when it comes to MDay?
Well, I mean, it's obviously our game plan. I think we did 5 M&As in 30 months at Energy Metals, and I like them. Just to start with, it's easier to buy resources than find them and develop them. Much less expensive in any part of the fuel, and not just fuel cycle, but any part of the commodity cycle, most of the time. And I've done probably 15 of them over my career. So we're certainly looking at those. The Westwater transaction we finished last year with was obviously a good key transformational event for us, but it's certainly not an easy field now, and it never has been in the uranium industry. There's, I don't know, maybe 100 companies out there that are uranium companies, but really when you're looking at quality assets, especially when we restrict our field of expertise or operations to North America and in particular US ISR, we keep narrowing down the collective pool of interesting properties and or companies. But I'm confident that, in order for, it's not just our preposition, but it's a need of the industry to consolidate. Right now there's 11 licensed ISR plants. We have 2 of them. There's 2 over here, 1 over there. Cameco's got 3. Taking Cameco out of the picture, you've got the 4 or 5, 6 of these operators that at some point during this fuel cycle are going to see the need from a financial standpoint, not from a stock promotional end standpoint necessarily, but from a financial standpoint of combining. Because you really need to, in our estimation, get up to that 5 to 6 million pound a year production level to really maximize your profit potential, with at least 2, maybe 3 different sources or plants that are producing that, to really maximize the potential of the industry here. So it's not entirely up to us, obviously. We've certainly kicked a lot of tires. Not all the transactions out there are public. There's certainly some private ones that are available as well. And, it's not inconceivable that new plants will be built. In fact, I suspect there will be. So it's not that you have to acquire additional production facilities. Also, I'd point out that if you have a production facility, the satellite idea of taking a satellite well field and loading your resin there and transporting it, you can transport it a great distance because it's a very high dollar commodity. If you can load your resin at 5% or something along those lines, it becomes a very high dollar commodity. And, while maybe not attractive at current prices, if we get any sort of a significant increase in prices, then, it obviously expands the radius from which you can ship. So I guess, to sum it up, there's not a huge variety of potential candidates out there that are, worthy in terms of asset quality. But there's certainly enough to make it interesting. So I'm highly confident we'll get there. Just have to be a little picky and work things out to where it's in shareholders of both companies' interest if it's public, or shareholders of ours interest and a private entity as well. So there's a number of routes, but I think we'll get there.
Yep. And when you go and when you think about sort of valuing uranium companies, what are your preferred metrics for valuation? Where are you sort of seeing the best value for ROI, at least at the moment?
Well, here again, we restrict ourselves to ISR, and here primarily because it's economically advantageous and certainly time-wise advantageous. You can get an ISR permitted into production a lot quicker than a conventional mine, all things being equal. Also, building a conventional mill is a significant undertaking. I won't say it's an impossible one, but Energy Fuels has the only conventional mill in the U.S. that's operational or likely to be that way. For this fuel cycle. And so they're sort of the 800-pound gorilla on the conventional side. And the barriers to entry on that side, while mining it is not particularly onerous on permitting, the processing of it is, and building a mill certainly is. You have tailings to deal with, all sorts of issues that you don't have to deal with in situ. So our timeline to permit and CapEx is so much lower. And then when you get to reclamation, so much less in terms of time and money to reclaim ISR. That's sort of where we place our value. So within that, there's two areas within people and personnel, which I think are probably the scarcest in the uranium industry, as I mentioned, and as well as the quality of the asset. And on that, you have to, certainly give a good deal of thought as to what jurisdiction it's in. Clearly, Wyoming and Texas are the two leading jurisdictions in the U.S. In terms of familiarity with the ISR process. Both agreement states, so that you don't deal with the NRC, you deal with the state level. And, they're very, very important to take those things into consideration as well, because an agreement state will put you through permitting a whole lot quicker than a non-agreement state.
Got it. And, just out of curiosity, are Cameco's U.S. assets, realistically actually for sale?
Say that again?
So, are Cameco's U.S. assets realistically for sale?
Probably, but, so far the reason they've been for sale and no takers is the huge liability that goes with them. The assets are undoubtedly attractive.
Yep.
But the legacy environmental tag to replace the bonds and look at the reclamation have been prohibitive thus far. The U.S. assets from Cameco were originally picked up to have a seat at the political table more than to really provide a huge amount of uranium for Cameco. I don't want to speak for Cameco. That may or may not still be an issue for them. I think they've certainly wavered on that point, away from the strength of the argument when they initiated the investments in the U.S. So I wouldn't be a bit surprised to see, if I'm right about the coming nuclear renaissance being a bit more of a, typical or ordinary business cycle, then I think that there'll be opportunities through that cycle somewhere for companies to maybe get together in terms of Cameco wanting to leave and companies in the U.S. Or elsewhere having U.S. operations coming in. But you're going to have to see operations start getting close to a profitable level before that happens, I think. Otherwise, it's just too big a bite to take, or too big a risk to take on the reclamation side.
Yep, got it. Another thing that enCore's been focused on is Group 11 and Group 11 technology. If I remember correctly, you're also a director on the board of Group 11, right? So so could you explain Group 11 and sort of elaborate on the likelihood and the potential impact it's going to have?
Sure. Group 11 is a bit of a wild card for enCore. We made an initial investment in it.
Yep.
We provide a bit of technical expertise to them as well. It's a private company, a U.S. private company. It has no intentions of going public. It was started as a consortium between, and still is, between enCore and EnviroLeach Technologies, also a listed company in Canada, as 40% shareholders, and then the Golden Predator is a 20% shareholder. Using environmental friendly chemistry and the ISR expertise of enCore, primarily led by Dennis Stover, who was one of the two patent holders on the original in situ applications in uranium, to take the chemistry that's benign essentially that EnviroLeach has and apply it to in situ metal opportunities other than uranium and other than copper. And obviously, if you're doing the research and development, gold is a very attractive target. Obviously, that's because if it only partially works, you still get a significant return on your investment, and as compared to a base metal or something. But we see it as having widespread applicability. It certainly is an attractive concept in that you do it with your tailings dams, your smelters, your on and on your mill. And you would enjoy those same benefits that ISR has, competitive advantages in the uranium industry, lower cost, lower capex, easier, less opposition, easier, reclamation, et cetera, less use of water. All of these things are big factors. And I think it will be proven to where it works on some things, some types of deposits. Obviously, ISR and uranium didn't happen overnight. And, in many ways, I think the next phase will be looking at other metals. They're already doing copper, and a few other metals have been done in various areas, at least on a pilot scale, including some rare earths and some rhenium, various others, and in fact, some gold operations in select places. Although I'd mentioned they've all used very toxic chemicals. Yep. And so have been some rather bad repercussions from that. So, I look at it as there's 50 pieces of the puzzle in the box. There's been significant work done on all the puzzle pieces. And it's up to a good quality research team, which we've assembled at Group 11, to put the time together to put those puzzle pieces together to really be able to get the first field test to show some success and then fine tune it to where it might become a reality, in 4 or 5 years.
Got it. What actually distinguishes, as you mentioned, you have an awesome research team. So what distinguishes enCore from the rest of the pack? So is it majorly the team, or are there, other multiple factors that do so?
Well, I think there's multiple factors. I mean, clearly the added bonus of, a couple of non-core assets that are wild cards like enCore, like Group 11, which could revolutionize the mining industry if it really goes through to fruition. But at the core value proposition, you've got a team that's, as I mentioned, Dr. Stover was the first, one of the two first people in situ. We've got an elite in situ team that I would put up against anybody. Paul Goranson, our CEO, he's worked on, been to, or built or operated just about every ISR plant in the U.S. And in addition to having seen most of them at Kazakhstan when he was president of Cameco Resources. So, having him join our team this past year really cemented and reinvigorated the leadership position. But, if you look at the team across the board, we've got tremendous expertise in terms of operating skills, with the exception of myself. Not an operator by any means, but I put him up against anybody in the business. And so that's our real key advantage. In the US, data is proprietary. And we have probably the largest database aside from Orano and Cameco in the business. And, it's a cumulative total of, I don't know if it were still in hard paper form, well over 2,000 filing cabinets. It's probably a dozen companies that have been in the business that are proprietary data that we've been accumulating since 1986. So it's, a substantial advantage over many of the folks that are coming in, especially in terms of evaluating known deposits. Here again, I'm not a big fan of exploration, not taking anything away from it, especially in certain environments like the basin in Canada, where you might hit some real high grade. But I question the need. There's lots and lots of deposits that are known or partially identified. And having databases really is a key plus when you're going in to evaluate those, especially in the US where the data is not registered and not publicly available. And of course, the key is we've got two licensed plants. So that's a big head start. So when you combine, the database, the people, the licensed plants, a good healthy endowment of uranium held in the company already, it's a pretty good value proposition, I think. That, and of course, we've been there and done it before, which is no certainty of success, but it certainly doesn't hurt.
Yep, got it. So, moving on, I wanted to go and talk about, do you have any thoughts on sort of the general timeline of the uranium market or uranium cycle? So how far do we go? How long does it last? And, do we have, say, another spike at the end, like all other uranium bull markets? So what are your thoughts on the general timeline?
Well, my thoughts aren't as popular as a lot of folks would like them to be. I think we're going to gradually move higher. I think the big significant thing is, last year the headwinds turned to tailwinds. Mm-hmm. Nothing really exciting yet. There's a whole lot more interest in uranium now than there was early in the last cycle, 04 to 08. The ETFs are a huge factor now that weren't present last time around.
Yep.
In addition, social media is a huge factor that wasn't there last time around. So, and the general education level of the investors is far superior to that of last time. It's still a pretty complex task or industry to get your head around, especially the entire fuel cycle.
Yep.
But I can remember doing talks in 04 and 05, and there were a lot of guys in the uranium business that had a hard time spelling uranium. And the investors were further behind than that. But this time we've got a very sophisticated investor group, much more and much broader. So, your prices are indicating that ahead of time. It's moving a little bit more than it did last time. With that come expectations, and it seems to be, maybe that's the social media, I don't know. But, there's great expectations for the US government helping to subsidize uranium prices. We never really bought into that because it's a drop in the bucket in the world market. And here again, them supporting the nuclear industry is very important. Supporting the uranium industry, it'd be nice, but it's not critical. If you can't function in an open market, then you probably shouldn't be there, is my view. So, but I think you'll see a less explosive market than you saw last time around, with one caveat. Last time we went to $140 from 7 or 14 or something. So,
yep.
But here again, that was a supply constraint, almost a panic. This time, demand driven, I think, will be a bit slower. The one thing that may change that and may give us a spike is the participation by the production companies as well as hedge funds and family offices in buying and speculating in the commodity directly. And, especially with the new Sprott fund coming on, it's a big chunk of money now. It could be a whole lot bigger. Things start to move, you'll tend to see hedge funds coming in. We've already seen some folks that are have accounts at Converdyne that are buying on behalf of several different family offices, because it takes a while to get set up to buy directly. So that's sort of the wild card, in my opinion, that could add some real sauce to it, or add some real fire to it whenever that kicks in.
Yep.
But aside from that, I think you're going to see a pretty orderly movement. I think you'll see most of the next decade in the $50 to $80 not adjusted for inflation pricing, mm-hmm. which should be enough to give the industry a very nice return on investment, nice profit profile, and dare I say a more of a traditional market that where you've got producer and consumer in tandem, and everyone makes a bit of money and everyone expands in a healthy environment. Probably way too optimistic for a prolonged period. Yep. In any business these days, but especially in uranium. But I can see the setup for that happening with most of we had a blip in 86. We had a 3-year run in the last market, and they've all been very short. But I think we're really set up for the first prolonged boom period or relative prosperity period in uranium since pre-3 Mile Island, and that's going back to the 70s. Wow. So I'm quite optimistic about the long term. Not to say there won't be some hiccups along the way, but
absolutely. And to use sort of a baseball analogy, what inning would you say we're in as with respect to the uranium bull market? Just to sort of.
I actually think we're in the warm-ups. I don't think the game's started yet. Or maybe the first inning if you really want to get into it. But it's clearly early on because the big consumers haven't stepped up.
Yep.
The nuclear utilities buying are what move this market ultimately. Those are the ultimate consumers of our product, and they haven't even shown up yet. They're out there doing a bit. We announced a contract today that starts in 2023 for market related deliveries. But you aren't seeing very many contracts yet. You aren't seeing many RFPs coming from the nuclear utilities looking for material. When you do see them, they're for 2023, 2024, and out years. Maybe some late 22 deliveries. But once they really come in, like I say, that's why I think this is a bit of a warm up. Everyone's getting familiar and looking at the game and, getting their seats ready for the game. But I think the game really hasn't begun in earnest yet.
Got it. And do you have any thoughts on sort of the polarized world of of nuclear? So countries like Germany, they're actually trying to shift away from nuclear, but then China is sort of moving towards nuclear. So do you have any thoughts, and what's your take on the overall polarization of the world when it comes to uranium?
Well, I think we've lived in a relatively prosperous time, and I don't know about you, but I'd rather pay my electric bill here than in Germany. I'm not much for $1 a kilowatt hour payment. When we've had a gold operation in the Yukon, we were only paying 50 cents for diesel. Wow. In a remote location. So, the electric rates in Germany, they're certainly paying through their pocketbook for their government's conviction. Mm-hmm. And, economic realities and priorities change as prosperous conditions change and as reality changes. It's almost a correlation of, you can't have green energy without, you can't just get there with the solar and the wind. So, economic times get a little bit different. They may decide that, they may like nuclear a little bit better. There have been a number of nations that have curtailed their nuclear plants only to go back on that and now start looking to expand them. I think here again, you're at the tail end of the anti-nuclear movement.
Yep.
In the very early stages of the pro-nuclear movement, and you got a bit of crosswinds there.
Got it. This is sort of tongue-in-cheek, but to wrap up the podcast, will enCore Energy be larger than the energy metal success of the last cycle?
Well, I'm a firm believer in it never hurts to set your goals high because you'll seldom exceed them. So we can only hope, but it really doesn't enter into our calculations. If where we're going to be, that would be nice. It'd be nice to be half as big as Energy Metals was last time. That would be fine. I think the best way to get there, it's sort of like people ask, are you, in whatever, not just uranium, but any mining company, are you looking to be acquired? Do you want somebody to come and take you over? And I always say, the best way to make your company attractive to others or with a big market cap, it's really not that complicated in terms of their game plan. Excuse me. And that's execute. You just do the best thing that you can with the assets you can get and put them into a profitable format, increase the value of them. And by virtue of that, you aren't worrying about your ultimate goal. You aren't worrying about your 20-year plan or if you're going to get taken over. But what you'd end up doing is making yourself very attractive on all those fronts just by virtue of taking care of business on a day-to-day basis.
Yep. Got it. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was awesome having you. I figure, our audience is going to enjoy the interview just as much as I did. So thank you for being on.
Oh, thanks, Sheree. Really appreciated it. Great questions. And thanks to your audience.
Thank you.